In this video, I will talk about the results or findings section. How can we write a good results findings section? I think it's important to make one point up front. There are different types of research papers, different empirical papers. And depending on what kind of paper you're writing, then also the results section might look somewhat different. First of all, we have a quantitative study, maybe based on survey or panel data. A typical characteristic of such a study is that you have a theory and you would like to test your theory and you would like to test hypotheses. Then on the other hand, you have qualitative studies. These studies are often, not always, more exploratory in nature. You would like to explore your data. Yeah, you would more analyze your data more in exploratory fashion. You have more open questions. There is not easy yes or no. And very often then you would like to develop new theory or modify theory based on your findings. So these two studies, quantitative and qualitative, have very different purposes. And because of that, also the way how we write the results sections might be somewhat different. Let me go into detail in the following. Regardless of which type of study you're doing, I think the same focus as in the method section is important. Focus on the 3 C's, the principles of how to write a good methods and how to write a good results section. Remember, we talked about completeness, clarity, and credibility. Completeness refers to that you report all important findings. I will give you some more ideas what that means later. Clarity, that it should be written in a very clear, easy to understand fashion. Again, that varies if you do a quantitative or qualitative paper, but still clarity is important. And then third, credibility. That we can trust your results, that you to achieve that you describe your results well, and also in a way that it can be replicated, that readers can understand what you did and why you did it, so that you convey this credibility. Now let me go into the specifics of these different types of study. I begin with the structure of quantitative papers or quantitative studies. Here we have a very much given corset. It's given structure and you should follow if you would like to publish in these journals. So it usually consists of 2 or maybe 3 subsections. In the first section you would provide a brief overview of your main statistics, main information. This, however, means usually it's a very brief description. And to achieve that in a very concise and quick way is by providing a correlation table. If you analyze data, you run regression, structural equation modeling or whatever it is, usually you put certain variables in relation. And an expectation is that you present a correlation table, including also maybe mean values, standard deviations, and then of course the correlations. If you have scales, you would also include Cronbach's alpha there. It's a very important information that also helps reviewers to get a glimpse of your data, understand some kind of relationships. Also, it is possible, based on this correlation table, later on to rerun some of your statistics to test them, and in particular to use your correlation table later to run some meta-analysis, meaning analyzing your and other studies and finding some commonalities and differences. In the second subsection, you would then test your hypotheses. You can even label it as such. And here what I would like to emphasize is that you report the results for each hypothesis. I know, I've seen it before. Some people only report the supported, the confirmed hypotheses and do not report unsupported hypotheses. That violates, of course, clarity and credibility and completeness. We don't want that. So important, do report the result for each hypothesis, supported or not supported. And to increase clarity, what I would recommend here is that you follow the order of your hypotheses. So first, you report the results of hypothesis 1, blah, 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 confirmed or not confirmed, then hypothesis 2. Hypothesis 2 states that this, blah, 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 and that. Findings show hypothesis 2 was confirmed, and then you can add maybe some statistics, and that you go one by one after the other. That's easy to read. And what also helps to increase clarity is to provide tables and or figures. Then the third subsection, not all papers necessarily need them, but at least I would encourage you to think about it, to conduct additional robustness tests and report some of them. Because we would like to know whether your findings are really applicable to your sample and also rule out some other related or alternative explanations. And for that reason, you conduct some robustness tests and maybe you report some of the most important ones. For quantitative papers, there's a template. For qualitative papers, it's very different. For qualitative papers, you have a lot of discretion. You have a lot of freedom how to write a qualitative study. That allows some creativity. At the same time, I would say it also makes it more difficult to write a qualitative paper because there's no common standards, and also there are some reviewers who like this type of writing and some like other types. Yeah, but regardless, there are some common features of a qualitative paper, of the finding section, how it can be written in a more convincing way and also considering the 3 C's. So first, I would like to start with a tip. I think that is the most important one, because you have to think how to write it. There's no common given structure. You have to think yourself, what kind of structure would make sense? What I would usually recommend is that you structure your qualitative studies along certain themes or certain concepts. Or, what also makes good sense, if you have very clear research questions, that you organize your finding section according to your research questions. So that could be maybe you start with an overall overview of your data, and then you would continue with research question 1, and then you would follow up with research question 2, and so it's organized by your research questions. Or if it's more open one, you organize it by themes that have emerged from your data analysis. That is the first step. Later, when you analyze your data and also the way you report it, you would also like to provide some more insights. How do the findings differ? Differ by groups, differ for instance by gender. Men and women have different responses to certain food or whatever that is. And then you can distinguish and show their similarities or differences across different people and also within different people. There might be also sometimes inconsistencies, particularly if you're doing more some kind of interpretative qualitative research. What is very common and what I would also recommend is that you provide some interpretation. Don't just state and repeat what the respondent said or what the text tells you, but you would also go beyond that. And that is where your brain comes in. That's where your contribution is, that you interpret, consolidate and interpret the findings from your qualitative data. That's related to my next point. Avoid being overly descriptive. Not just only describe. Of course, it's qualitative studies, it's easier, there's a tendency to it. But there it comes the research aspect. And also reviewers. And their interest in your conceptualizations, in your interpretation and in your theorization. That's more important. Of course, sometimes you describe, but one step beyond that, you want to interpret and theorize your findings. One common mistake of qualitative papers, or one problem, is that you would like to report all your findings. Just imagine you have conducted 100 interviews. If you put this in writing, you transcribe all this data, that may translate into more than 1,000 pages. But a research paper, as we know, is only 20 to 30 pages long. How can you compress that? And you, oh no, I like this quote, I like this and that. But you have to be concise. And pick then the quotations or the stories that best fit your theorization or that very well illustrate certain points. And when selecting these kind of highlights, what I would call highlights, try not to take the very short one, just one word might be a little short, unless you want to coin a term. And also overly long quotations, which would span one page, half a page, that's too much, because we want to hear your voice as a researcher, your interpretation, your theorization, and not the quotations themselves. Of course, you have to strike a balance. You also need to provide sufficient amount of data so that any reader and reviewer can really understand and follow. Particularly early on when you first submit your manuscript, it is very helpful to provide maybe a little more, but it can also be in tables and figures. It doesn't need to be all in the main body of the manuscript, so that reviewers get a feeling of your data and they can also give maybe more developmental and constructive feedback to you. When reporting any kinds of quotations or stories, I think it's always good to provide some background information. From where do you get this information? Who was the respondent? Because that also gives you some insights of that specific case. For quantitative papers, you have standardized correlation tables, regression tables, and so forth. Qualitative studies, that's not absolutely necessary. But I would strongly recommend using figures or tables, because tables can tell you so much and very quickly. They can be extremely powerful. So think very carefully what kind of tables, what kind of figures you would like to provide. And then you can use all kinds of figures to make your point. Try to be also a little more creative, because it's a qualitative study. Don't be confined to these box and arrows. There can be much more relationships and also other aspects, how certain things can be explained using a figure. Let me conclude. There are different types of empirical papers. There are quantitative papers and there are qualitative papers. Depending on what type of paper you're writing, you write a very different results or findings section. For quantitative studies, it's fairly straightforward. Please follow a template. You have the first subsection that is about descriptive statistics, followed by hypothesis testing, and maybe then a robustness test section. For qualitative studies, you have much more freedom. That's great, you can be creative. Yet there are also certain principles or guidelines that are helpful for writing stronger and more convincing qualitative studies. Okay, that's it for now. Good luck. Bye bye.